When we suffer something like grief or any kind of tragedy in our lives that leaves us reeling and leaves us suffering for quite some time and asking why and what if and all those sorts of questions that are really a slow process of coming to terms with what has actually happened, when we suffer in these ways, there's two basic aspects to our suffering. So one is the core suffering. If it's grief, it's the pain of loss. In any kind of tragedy or suffering from natural things in life or from from malevolence or whatever it is, there's a degree of sort of just coming to terms with the fact this thing has happened. That's the core of the suffering, but then there are also layers outside of that, and there are various types. One big one is that we have this core suffering, and then we have the level of suffering that's induced by our reaction to the core suffering. So I'm grieving, for example, or I've or my partner's left, and so there's that loss. But then there's thoughts like, I should have behaved differently, or if only I had said this, or if only I stopped them from doing that, or if only I told them to go to the doctor and get a checkup, or why does life keep doing this to me? So it's all these kinds of reactions we have to the core suffering, the core loss, and these inflate our suffering. You might say they double the suffering. So it's vitally important to learn to kind of disarm and deconstruct and dissolve this irrational inflation of our suffering, this second aspect of our suffering, because we can critique it and we can undo it. It's a kind of irrationality in us, a refusal to accept reality. Now, it's important, of course, to recognize, because we always have these flips. It's like a depressed person gets depressed about the fact they're depressed. We can do these funny tricks, and so a person can get frustrated themselves for the fact they have this secondary kind of suffering, but that's just more of the same. It's human, it's all too human to respond to reality when it's painful with a repudiation or a protest, with anger or disbelief or whatever. That's part of being human as well. So we have to accept that we have to accept that we're going to do this. We have to be compassionate with ourselves. That's wisdom in this context. And then work to undo the unnecessary suffering, the unnecessary thoughts, the refusal to believe, the tendency to blame ourselves as a way of avoiding the fact that it's happened. All the kind of irrational stuff around why me and if only I'd done this. The more we can undo those, the more we can get back to the core of the suffering and just contend with that. So we dissolve the suffering. That's the fundamental point I'm making here. I guess I'm also leading into a point that it also then enables us to focus on the core suffering and work on that. So it speeds our suffering along. It speeds the process along of moving through this. But it also, importantly, dissolves the 50% of our suffering which is unnecessary, and brings us back to the core, which is necessary in the sense of inescapable, that we then just focus on dealing with and processing and working through and so on.